The group we will talk about today is universally considered Australian. Most of the members who have made it up, are British natives. And their music continues through generations to resonate, to be timeless. But once this was just the dream of two brothers, of two young boys, Angus and Malcolm Young. And of course, I am talking about them, AC/DC. The new wave of British heavy metal was a national movement that began in England in the mid-70s and gained international attention in the early 80s. Although it encompasses various styles inherited from rock music, this movement is especially remembered for infusing previous heavy metal with the intensity of punk rock to produce fast and aggressive songs. Although CDC never wanted to be identified or associated with punk rock, there are many things to say about it. But before starting, let me introduce myself as always. For those who don't know me, I am Wanda. This channel is called Morbid One Biographies, and here I talk each time about the life of one or more legendary figures from the world of music and the band or bands. Now related, you will find the links to my social media below. Let's not waste time. Intro. AC/DC was formed in the early 70s Australian music scene by the two brothers Angus and Malcolm Young, with Angus on lead guitar and Malcolm on rhythm guitar. This period is commonly referred to as the third wave of rock music, and there were other Australian bands that rode the wave, for example, the Easy Beats, but they did not achieve the success they hoped for. Meanwhile, AC/DC as an Australian band are not only important in Australia, but worldwide, and they are considered one of the greatest rock bands of all time. All of this was achieved thanks to the vision of the young brothers and also to the frenetic rhythms they brought to their pieces. But not only because of this. It is also due to AC/DC's stage presence, and especially their explosive live performances. Some of you might know I always like to start from the beginning to talk about the childhood, when possible, of the protagonists of our stories. Angus and Malcolm Young were the youngest of the 8 children of William and Margaret Young, who moved to Sydney, Australia from Scotland, along with their parents, siblings, the whole family, as a result of the Great Freeze of 1963. That was one of the worst winters ever recorded in Scotland, with snow as deep as 8 feet, which is about 2.5 meters. During that time, there was even a continuous advertisement broadcast offering Scottish residents an assisted relocation to Australia. And it is for this reason that part of the Young family moved, along with Malcolm and Angus. Other brothers and their sister also relocated, including George, who would be very important for the boys' careers. All the male members of the Young family played at least one instrument. Another brother who would later become an important musician but would remain in Great Britain is Alex. Meanwhile, Angus started playing the guitar at just 5 years old, inspired by his brother Malcolm. The first guitar was an instrument he modified himself, which he made with his own hands. Later on, Malcolm gifted him a Hofner. When they arrived in Australia, they initially felt a bit disoriented, even though they were still protected by a large community that had moved with them. In fact, what you see in this photo is the Villawood Migrant Hostel. It is the largest migrant reception center in Australia. At the time, it housed former citizens of Great Britain. And it was right here that his brother George met another migrant, Harry, Wanda, but we will see more about this later. Later, the family moved here to the house you see in this photo, which later became the subject of controversy, because it was recently demolished. The brothers Malcolm and Angus Young were really allergic to school. They just couldn't stand it. And so they decided to start playing in some bands very early on, but also to work. In fact, Malcolm went to work in a bra factory and Angus became an illustrator for a magazine. What you see in this photo, quite recognizable, if you know, is a very young Angus Young in 72 playing in his band, singing key. Did I say that right? Malcolm, on the other hand, will be part of the Velvet Underground, but be careful. They are not the more renowned Velvet Underground of Andy Warhol, Lou Reed, Velvet Underground, and Nico, but another parallel entity, even though the origin of the name is the same. The two will then continue to play together, but in the formations of their brother George, who had put together Berry Band especially, in the Marcus Hoffner Hall Band. But then at a certain point, they will look each other in the face and say, let's collaborate, you and I, since we know where we want to go. And from that moment on, they became inseparable. They already were before, let alone now. The name AC/DC came very early. It seems it was suggested by their sister Margaret, who had a sewing machine on which was written alternating. Current, direct or current, and thus AC/DC. And to the brothers it seemed perfect because it indicated the power of their music, the one they were already creating and the one that would come later, but not everything went smoothly. Also because alternating current, direct, current. In slang, it refers to bisexual people who have no issues being with both people of their own sex and the opposite sex. And so, when the brothers found this out, it stopped them for a moment. It seems that Malcolm Young learned this news sometime later, even from a taxi driver who explained to him what it meant. And, well, there was also the doubt about changing the name. Fortunately, they didn't do it. Around the name AC/DC, many conspiracy theories have arisen concerning serial killers, occult meanings, satanic meanings. The name AC/DC could, if one wants to see it from this perspective, also stand for Antichrist, Devil, Child. So, well, the band members have always objected and said that it has nothing to do with it. Later on, they were also accused of having inspired the infamous serial killer Richard Ramirez, who killed many people, because a friend of his later declared that he was a big fan of AC/DC and that he was inspired to kill the people he had killed. And in that horrible way, because he had listened to Highway to Hell from 79. In fact, here we are already projected and all this mess. Erickson Ramirez will do it in 85. But this is just to make you understand how easy it is to create urban legends, obviously with hidden meanings, theories, and conspiracies behind a rock band. But none of this has anything to do with it, absolutely nothing. The very first original lineup included Dave and Evans, the very first singer of AC/DC, Harry Van Cleated, bassist, and the drummer Rolling Burgess. The very first concert of AC/DC was held on December 31st, 1973 in Sydney. But now let's take a moment to see how the idea of Angus Young dressing as a schoolboy was born. The idea, it wasn't his. It was his sister Margaret's, who suggested he dress that way to give the impression, considering Angus's slender build, of a schoolboy rushing straight from school to play rock without even changing. And Angus's very first uniform was actually lent to him by his sister, who took it from her little son. However, before dressing as a student, even as a schoolboy, Angus Young adopted other outfits. In fact, Angus also tried wearing a gorilla suit, a Superman costume, and a Zorro outfit. And in the very early days, the other members of AC/DC also wore costumes. For example, on one occasion, Malcolm Young wore an aviator suit, while other members dressed as New York police officers as the Joker. But then it was decided that the only one who should wear something iconic should be Angus. And it was precisely during this period that his move, the Jackwalk, was born. Angus Young's biggest fear, and at the time, was being ridiculed. As mentioned, he was extremely insecure, especially when he was very young, in Marco, and in that infamous 1974, before the first concert where he would wear the uniform, he felt quite unwell before going on stage, but decided to do it anyway without overthinking. And he began to adopt this move, the duck walk, to give himself confidence. But believe me, guys, he lost sleep over it for days. Because of this, basically out of fear that something might be thrown at him on stage, like bottles, fruit, etc. Fortunately, everything went contrary to his expectations and fears, and he was praised almost immediately. The CDs initially only covered songs by the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, and Chuck Berry, but the guys didn't want to stay there. They wanted to move forward. They wanted to break through. And so, fortunately for them, they were produced by the Young brothers' sibling, George, from Harry and Wanda, whom I mentioned earlier. In this way, they managed to create their own pieces in a style that had never been created before, wanting to win over the favor of the very young. And the first symbol of AC/DC, I Can't Sit Next to You Girl, was later re-recorded by Bon Scott. We've reached this point, guys, because up until now the singer had been Dave Evans. But he wasn't liked much by the brothers because he didn't have the energy they desired. Dave Evans, unfortunately, soon saw his place taken by the hysterical blues screamer Bon Scott, who was quite a bit older than the Young brothers. I've talked about Bon Scott's story in my episode dedicated to him, so, well, we need to move quickly here. Originally from Scotland, like the Young brothers, Bon Scott already had numerous experiences behind him within the emerging Australian rock scene. He had been part of the bands Fraternity and Valentines. He was already in contact with George Young's Easy Beats, and at the same time was very intriguing because he had lived through truly dangerous life experiences, including failed marriages, furious arguments, brawls, alcohol abuse, and prison. And also a dramatic motorcycle accident in which he miraculously survived but came out quite shaken. And above all, completely or almost completely toothless. Bon Scott was nearly 30 when he met the Young brothers, who were actually about 18 years old or so. He felt very frustrated because he hadn't succeeded in the past with his bands, especially with the Fraternity, in achieving the success he hoped for, and had gone on a tour in London, which had been quite disastrous, from which he emerged, I repeat, completely discouraged. In fact, he was doing a completely different job when he was contacted. Among various jobs, he had been a crab fisherman, a bouncer, a truck driver. He had been stalked by the police, arrested because he had stolen liters and liters of gasoline. Moreover, he had been rejected by the army because he was considered an absolutely socially truly dangerous character, and therefore a problem for society. In short, he was an outcast. Luckily, however, Bon Scott had that accident, because if it hadn't happened, he absolutely wouldn't have gone from Adelaide to attend the emerging AC/DC concert of the time, but he would probably have been somewhere else. It was Vince Lovegrove, a friend of Bon Scott and former colleague Michael of Bon Scott, who suggested Bon to AC/DC, to Angus and Malcolm. Initially, they were uncertain because, I repeat, he was in their eyes old. He was almost 30. But then, after their performance, when Bon Scott tried out some pieces with them, there was a spark. an incredible chemistry, and besides the great energy and Bon Scott's wonderful voice, he completely embodied the idea that the two brothers had of the singer they wanted with them. There was also mutual respect and admiration that would last until the end of days of Bon Scott. And our Bon, who was described as ugly, really ugly and exempted, I repeat, still perfectly embodied the working class idol. So he was very much liked by the audience. And then we add his amazing voice. The band's great ambitions were about to be realized, but along with them, there was also an important change in the band's lineup. It's 1975, they enter Albert Studios and record the first one. The album High Voltage, intended for the Australian market like the following TNT, in fact in 1976, but for the European market, High Voltage was re-released. However, in the European version of the album, only some tracks from the first High Voltage were included, that is. It's a Long Way to the Top, If You Wanna Rock and Roll, was one of these, which we remember well, fantastic, because Bon Scott in this track plays the bagpipes, which blend perfectly with Angus Young's guitar. And I repeat, I also talk about this. In the video dedicated to Bon Scott, I go into detail. The fact is that with Bon Scott, everything became more concrete, more accessible. Why Bon Scott? In reality, when he did his first tour in London, it's true that it was a failure for him in terms of success. But he learned how to be on stage, to really sing, to become a fantastic screamer. And so, practically all of this led to AC/DC achieving incredible success. In fact, they went to London with Scott for their first tour. At that time, punk rock was exploding. In Great Britain, in fact, the records were being sold identified with this genre, which they hated because they considered it a passing trend. They didn't want to be identified with punk. It's just that Bon Scott now had the life he had always wanted. So sex, orgy, drugs, and rock and roll with no breaks. So he abused everything, considering how long it had taken him to get there. He used to say, I will die young, but I will die happy. And unfortunately, this would happen shortly thereafter. So some members of AC/DC adopted a true on-the-road lifestyle of a rock and roll star, whereas Angus Young is one of the few who maintained an absolutely clean lifestyle, except for the fact that he smoked a lot of cigarettes, but he never did. He never used anything, in fact, in the years after, when AC/DC would land in America and the DEA would stop them to see if they were carrying anything with them. They always asked what the little one was carrying, and the others would reply, but it's chocolates and candies. And it was true. It was exactly like that. And in my opinion, this is the most rock thing of all. For many, however, and you can also tell me your opinion if you can, the true driving force of the band was Malcolm Young, because he was the creator of most of AC/DC's iconic riffs. Malcolm Young was not only the rhythmic engine of the band, he was the soul of their creative vision, based on an essential approach to songwriting. He was responsible for the sonic imprint that made AC/DC's sound unique. His ability to craft memorable riffs and songs with little more than 3 chords establishes him not only as one of the best rhythm guitarists of all time, but also as one of the most brilliant composers in rock. Bon Scott's addictions were beginning to make him a different person, starting to change his personality until the tragic end. In 1977, the band entered the studio to record their album Leather Be Rock, and in the same year they embarked on a tour with Black Sabbath. And, while Scott bonded a lot with Ozzy Osbourne, as expected, the same did not happen between the members of the respective bands. In fact, the quarrel between Giselle Butler and Malcolm Young is memorable, in which it seems that Giselle Butler threw a punch, knife handle at the same Malcolm, but there are different versions. According to Angus Young's version, Johnson Butler showed this knife to Malcolm Young, who quickly took it from him and then said, "Now what do you want to do with this knife?" And initially it ended there, only that Malcolm Young felt a great sense of guilt about this action he had taken. Towards Giselle Butler, he wanted to apologize, but Ozzy stopped him, dissuading him by saying, "No, look, you did well because he's an idiot." More or less, that's how it went. However, Giselle Butler's version is that he never pointed the knife at Malcolm Young. But since he was, well, quite heated from the alcohol, from the fumes of the alcohol, having seen him with the knife, he started to provoke by saying, "What do you think you're going to do with that knife?" In short, she was bothered by the sight of Geezer with this weapon in hand. In 1977, Mark Evans was fired, and this was due to musical differences and personality clashes with Angus Young. He was replaced on bass by Cliff Williams. Voscold explained that Williams was more experienced, while Malcolm wanted a bassist who was also a backing vocalist. Power Age was released on May 5th, 1978, followed by If You Want Blood, You Got It, which will be the only live album recorded with the presence of Bon Scott. At the time, albums, especially live ones, but not only, had songs with very long solos in 10, 11, 12 minutes, whereas this last album aimed to go against the trend. It succeeded precisely because the tracks were very short, they were very fast. Highway to Hell, the band's sixth album, is also the most iconic. It will have incredible success. We are in 1978, and the success of Highway to Hell will later be surpassed by Back in Black. But let's stay for a moment on this album, which steps away slightly from the frivolous tones of the previous albums, yet maintains the driving, pounding, and rhythmic beats of all AC/DC albums. Highway to Hell is everything, even today, the anthem that makes AC/DC recognizable all over the world. So if you say the word AC/DC, immediately the chorus of this song comes to mind, truly the band's anthem. On January 27th, 1980, in Moscow, he takes the stage at the Game On Theatre in Southampton for a concert of the Highway to Hell tour. According to one of the band's managers, Doug Taylor, when international success had finally arrived, and so we are in this period, the 80s, or rather the early 80s, Bon Scott had already given everything. On stage, he was always the same, one of the greatest frontmen ever, but afterwards it was clear that something was wrong. And in September, they set off for their first headlining tour in America, traveling across the United States on a luxury tour bus that can accommodate up to 12 people. They fill the concerts, but Bon Scott begins to lose control. For example, in Phoenix, he misses the plane because he's trying to win over a girl in a bar. He takes all kinds of substances and is always drunk, suggesting to Bon Scott to go to rehab, to detox, was an impossible thing because he didn't even consider it. In fact, if someone made the suggestion, he would get angry. Even on February 9th, 1980, AC/DC are in Spain to participate and perform on a show called Aplauso. And that is Bon Scott's last live performance. 6 days later, on February 15th, 1980, he is found dead in a Renault 5, parked in front of his friend Alistair Kinnear's house at number 67 Overhill Road, after an alcohol-fueled night at the Music Machine Club in Camden Town, London. The official cause of death is acute alcohol poisoning. Bon Scott was only 33 years old. And this is the end of a life lived to the fullest, a life that entered the myth without restraint. One that led Bon to live exactly as he wanted, but to burn out his life in a flash. And you might ask, how do we get to Brian Johnson? We get there thanks to Bon Scott, unfortunately. Or fortunately. When Bon Scott's bandmates, years earlier, they were on tour in Great Britain, opening for the band Geordie, which was Brian Johnson's group. And between Bon and Brian, a bond was born. Immediately. A friendship also due to the alcohol level, but not only that, Bon greatly admired Brian Johnson as an artist, and during that concert they did together, Brian Johnson was struck by an appendicitis attack during his performance. Sid Roint was on stage writhing in pain. Bon Scott didn't understand this. He thought Brian was doing it on purpose, and he really liked it. Then in the evening, they all got together for a night of drinking, and that was it. Let's go back to 1980. Bon Scott dies of alcohol poisoning, and Angus and Malcolm Young are devastated and don't know whether to continue or not. And one of the people who will convince them to do so will be Bon Scott's own mother. They were reaching global success, but they weren't at the top yet, and it was the time of Highway to Hell. A fan of AC/DC from Cleveland, Ohio, managed to contact Bon Scott, brothers, to bring them closer. And he himself had followed Brian Johnson's band in London. So he was a die-hard fan, and he told them, look, there's this singer who is really great, Brian Johnson and the Brothers. And they remembered that Bon Scott in life had often told them about meeting this singer who had impressed him. He had stayed in his heart. And let's remember that Bon Scott wasn't someone who admired many singers. In fact, he was very critical. And this was the first coincidence. And even one of their producers, who had nothing to do with the fan from Cleveland, told them about this singer he had seen who was very good, named Brian Johnson. So the brothers looked at each other and said it was a coincidence. It might be fine, but more than one is not, and we have to audition him. Brian, however, in the meantime, was living with his parents in his hometown, Newcastle, and had practically retired from music because his band, the Geordies, weren't going anywhere and had remained in the local club circuit. And so he had even opened his own auto body shop. One day, Brian Johnson received a phone call from a woman with an Eastern accent, and she told him that a very famous band wanted to audition him. At first, the woman didn't want to tell Brian right away that this band was AC/DC, but eventually she gave in and did. Brian Johnson, I won't tell you that he thought it was a joke, but he was convinced that he would never pass this audition. In fact, at first, he declined the offer. Brian Johnson was in Newcastle. The audition was in London, so we are in Great Britain. Oh, sorry, I didn't specify earlier to Tinan. Brian Johnson, moreover, said, but what do I drive? 6 hours to do what? For what? To have another disappointment? I've already pulled myself out of the music world. I've put a nice block on it. But sometimes fate intervenes. And when he goes there, guys, like Baku, a friend of Brian Johnson from Monscott Python found him a job for a commercial for a vacuum cleaner. Brian Johnson had to sing the jingle for the vacuum cleaner for £350 in London. Was that a lot of money back then? At that point, he was encouraged to get in the car. And as luck would have it, AC/DC were in London. And fate wanted this new gig to actually lead Brian to audition with AC/DC. The audition went great. Brian Johnson with the band, they played some Chuck Berry, Ike and Tina Turner songs, and they had fun. In the end, it became more of a jam session than an audition. Malcolm and Angus didn't want him to leave. Stay here, they said, but they didn't give him an answer right away. And Brian actually had to return to his primary job, to his work. The one that put food on the table, so he left them, said goodbye, to return to Newcastle, but a few days later he received the final phone call. And the rest is history. With Brian Johnson, the band completed the writing, the creation of the tracks that had begun with Moscota for the album Back in Black, which is absolutely one of the best-selling albums of all time and the best-selling of all AC/DC's albums. Brian Johnson experienced the first months with AC/DC like a waking dream, and he was convinced that at some point the band would realize that he was a nobody, and that it was all a joke, so he struggled a lot with the idea that his life, the one as a normal person, was over. He was truly in his dream, but he was terrified to stay, and he would say, it was scary, beautiful, but scary because I was 32 years old and I wondered what I was doing there. I was convinced that a couple of days later they would realize that he wasn't much. The following album, For Those About to Rock, also sold well, an excellent confirmation of the band's good form, and it will be especially remembered for the title track, which would close all subsequent concerts, whereas the next one is intentionally essential. The 1983 album Flick of the Switch saw the departure of drummer Phil Rudd, who had ongoing disputes with Malcolm Young. Phil Rudd also had long-term alcohol substance dependencies and would only return in 1994 after an experience as a helicopter pilot in New Zealand. Phil Rudd, an absolutely complex character, many years later would face a serious charge of hiring a hitman to kill two people. Between 83 and 88 approximately, the band would experience a slight decline, but then they would recover in 88. In 88, blow up your video helps to turn things around, but 88 is also a dangerous year because Malcolm Young is overwhelmed by his addictions, overwhelmed by alcoholism. But unlike Bon Scott, fortunately, he recognizes he has a problem and decides to seek help. He will be replaced by his nephew Stevie. Stevie, young son of one of the Young brothers. The Razor's Edge was the album that actually opened the band's second golden era, thanks also to the monstrous live performances and the commitment of another band. The impact that AC/DC continued on to have and give to the audience, something that practically still happens. I don't like listing all the albums, all the events, as if it were a shopping list. I would take a big leap forward to reach 2014, which was a year. Well, very difficult, very challenging. So Brian Johnson initially gives a very detailed interview stating that there will be a follow-up to the success of Black Ice and that the band will return to the studio to record new material. But unfortunately, around the same time, everything becomes overshadowed as it becomes clear that there are some issues looming, health issues. And I'm talking about Malcolm Young's health, who had dementia. Think back to 2008. By 2014, Malcolm Young had significantly worsened and had completely lost his short-term memory. Due to the insurmountable health issues of Malcolm Young, his nephew Stevie Jr. returns and will stay, practically forever. And it is precisely during this period that the whole mess explodes. Due to Phil Rudd's ongoing and complex legal lawsuit, after the release of Rock or Bust. In 2014, the Phil Rudd case explodes. I mentioned it a little while ago. Phil Rudd apparently financed a hitman with a whopping $133,000 to kill two people from his entourage. In fact, Phil Rudd had several collaborators working for him and had produced an album of his own that had done very poorly. After hiring the hitman, he called him one of the two potential victims who remains unknown, saying that he had hired someone to take out this employee. The whole situation will be resolved without Firud's arrest, even though the police will break into his house and find everything imaginable. All the substances you can imagine were present in that house and in 2016 to add fuel to the fire. Brian Johnson will experience an incredible deterioration in his hearing, and Axl Rose will complete the end of that tour. In fact, there were controversies and the fans went into a frenzy during that period. They were worried and many tickets were refunded, precisely because the SDC were unable to handle this situation well, that is the one. With Brian Johnson, who couldn't finish the tour, adding another burden, the worst, the definitive one. Unfortunately, in the fall of 2017, George and Malcolm Young both passed away about a month apart. The causes that led to George's death, who passed away in Singapore at the age of 70, are still unknown, whereas, unfortunately, we know well the cause of Malcolm's death. Angus Barr, during the final stages of his life, I repeat, Malcolm spent many years in a care home. Angus would visit him and play the pieces that Malcolm liked the most, especially the ones from when he was a kid. He played him many things from the Rolling Stones, etc., and Malcolm, like a child, would smile, clap his hands, and would let him know that he was happy, in short. So this was extremely heartbreaking. Power Up from 2020 is clearly dedicated to the passing of Malcolm Young. Fortunately, it was able to be released, also thanks to new techniques. And Brian Johnson's hearing has significantly improved. Then COVID played its part, slowing everything down. But after 7 years, Brian Johnson finally returns to the stage. The years have taken their toll on everyone, especially on Brian Johnson, but the band embarked on their tour to celebrate 50 years of their career. And they sold out with a single Italian stop in Reggio Emilia with as many as 100,000 spectators. And here we are all eagerly waiting for the 2025 tour to kick off right from Minneapolis. What can I say, guys? We've reached the end of this episode, and I ask you, as always, to add whatever you want in the comments. Whether it's observations, anecdotes, anything you wish to add will be appreciated, of course, with respect. Thank you for making it to the end, and I send you the usual embracing hug. Bye. Thank you.